Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Kat Allen in August 2022. Kat studies the ocean, both in the geologic past and in the present. Some of you may recognize Kat from the 2022 Maine Science Festival headlining event, The Warming Sea, an exploration of hope in the face of the climate crisis. Kat was part of our introductory panel, and her presentation provided some fantastic context for the rest of the evening. I really enjoyed hearing more from Kat about her work, and I hope you'll enjoy our conversation as much as I did. So, Kat, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm delighted to have you. Our paths first crossed at the Warming Sea this past March, where you were able to join us, part of the opening panel discussion of people who are researching about climate change in Maine. I'm doing that as a marker, so we get to that. But before we get there, I would really appreciate hearing how you got into science. I know you grew up in Maine and then went far afield in all good ways to get your education, and then were able to come back. So what was the science bug for you? And then how did you get into researching oceans and climate?
Well, it wasn't a straight path, I'll tell you. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do when I was a kid. I had a lot of different interests. One thing that was a constant, though, was that growing up on the coast of Maine and having access to the ocean was a big part of my life from the very beginning. And it was always a very special family-oriented outing when I was a kid to go to the beach and be on boats, and just had a lot of fond memories. But in terms of academic pursuits, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, even when I got to college. As you say, I did grow up in Maine, and then I went away. I went actually pretty far away from the ocean, now that I think about it, in my undergraduate degree in Cleveland, but still near water, and ended up falling in love with geology. I took an intro geology class that was just the history of everything, sort of the why of everything. Why is there a lake here? Why is there a mountain here? How did this world that we live in come to be? And it was just so fascinating. It was all different kinds of science. It wasn't just to explain the way things came to be. You have to understand chemistry and physics and biology and how they're all linked. And it sort of dissolves all of these artificial human divisions of science into just, who are we and what is this place? And I really enjoyed that as an undergraduate, just the sense of exploring and the hands-on nature of it, being outside. The field trips are often cited by geologists and earth scientists as the hook. And that was certainly part of it for me. When I was a kid, I thought maybe I wanted to be a journalist for National Geographic, or maybe I wanted to be a teacher, or maybe I wanted to go be an artist. I just wasn't sure, but I got the geology bug in college and then just pursued it from there and all over the world. And then eventually my husband and I figured out a way to come back to Maine. It took us several years, but we ended up finding a way to come home.
So you're an academic, and many academics have a long and meandering path, regardless of where they end up. And that includes things, not just undergrad and graduate school, but often a postdoc and further research positions. And I know that you're now in a tenure track position, which for many academics is the holy grail, because you really feel like you can finally put down roots. Has all of those research positions that you've had, have they all been focused on some piece of what you're doing now, or did they all build to what you're doing now?
They all have common threads. When I was an undergraduate, I started working on lake research because we were on Lake Erie, and I connected with a mentor at Case Western who was studying the history of Lake Erie. And that was really interesting. I mean, pulling stories out of mud, just the concept of it. And then the actual fun of doing it was really interesting. And then followed that to an NSF research experience for undergraduate program, or REU, to Lake Tanganyika in East Africa. And that was a whole nother level of exploration and experiencing different part of the world. And from there, I went on to a master's degree in the UK, continuing on that thread of large lake research and sort of diving into geochemistry a little bit deeper, sort of using chemical clues to the past to unearth events that I haven't seen myself, but that I could sort of piece together using these indicators of the past, sort of like a sleuthing puzzle. And then I decided that I was really interested in ocean research. I came back to my first love as a kid, being on the ocean. It's just covers most of the planet. It's vast. It's been around for a really long time. It's just, there was something about not just scientifically the importance of it on a planetary scale, but also there's just something visceral about it that I love. There's something very freeing about being out on the ocean and looking all around and not being able to see anything but blue. So I was very interested in pursuing more ocean science. And that's what I ended up doing for my PhD and my postdoc as well. I came back to the States and I was in the New York, New Jersey area for a while. And I did 2 postdocs. One of them was really focused on what we call paleoceanography, which is the history of the oceans, using fossils or any kind of physical remains you can get your hands on to understand how the world has evolved to get to this point. And another postdoc that I did, so that was a research postdoc. And then I also did a postdoc in education. I was primarily teaching for a year, just as part of a huge team of amazing scientists and educators at Columbia University, where it's called the Frontiers of Science program. And every first year student there has to take this class. It was a huge class, like 500 students each semester. And it was quite an experience. And we didn't just teach earth science. I had to learn how to teach neuroscience and astrophysics and intro, thank goodness. It was very eye-opening scientifically, and it was also a heck of a lot of fun because I got to meet scientists and really get to know them from all these different disciplines. It sort of busted open these barriers that are often in place when we're in our research silos. So I did a research and a teaching postdoc, and then managed to come up here with my husband, who'd been offered a job at the University of Maine. And I managed to get my foot in the door here too. So that was a very exciting dream come true, really.
So we've alluded to it a little bit, and maybe you talking about geology has hinted at it a little bit, but we could actually talk about what you do on a larger scale. I'm always struck by geologists. You all always strike me as among the most relaxed people I've ever met. And I have a theory. It's because geologic time is just so vast that you don't get worked up about things. And maybe that's just my own little stereotype that I've got going. But you're talking about fossils, which the amount of time frame we are talking about is almost unimaginable in many ways for us who are deep in the weeds of kind of modern day life. So this is your opportunity to both talk about in general what you do with the geology and the study of the oceans, but then take it away and talk about, in particular, any specific projects you would like to talk about with regards to the ocean in Maine. And I will be sure to be poking at you in all good ways about what we talked about, the warming sea as well.
Sure, absolutely. Specifically, what I do here at the university with my team, we investigate marine sediments. And marine sediments they represent this library of the earth. They've been around the ocean basins. They form and they are destroyed as well through plate tectonic processes. Typically, the ocean crust is not as old as much of the continental crust. It's just going through this constant recycling process. But there are, regardless, still pieces of ocean floor that go back 150 million years, which is still pretty respectable. And so there's this huge archive preserved on the seafloor of past events and lost worlds, if you will. And so my group and we specialize in using a particular kind of organism that makes a hard shell, calcium carbonate shell, very similar to one you would pick up on the beach, except tiny. So the shells that we typically study are the size of a grain of sand, give or take. And there are different kinds. There's some that live floating in the surface waters, so shallow in the sunlit depths of the ocean. And those are living and recording the conditions of where the atmosphere and the ocean are interacting on a daily basis. And then there are benthic organisms, or there are foraminifera, these single-celled organisms that live on the seafloor or even buried within seafloor sediments. And they record what's going on down there. So we specialize in extracting these from layered accumulating sediments and then learning from them. And the ways that we can learn from them are many. Even just identifying the types that are there. There's some species that prefer living in warm conditions. There's some species that prefer living in colder conditions. And even just presence or absence of certain species can tell you something right up front. That was initially where a lot of paleoceanography started, was just species identification and assemblage assessment. Now, my specialty is in the geochemistry of those shells themselves. So once we identify the shells, it kind of breaks my heart every time, but we either crush them and dissolve them and run them through a mass spectrometer, or we zap them with a laser. It's all very destructive. And after all this care of gently pulling them up from the seafloor and carefully washing them through sieves and carefully using detailed paintbrushes to, move them between different containers, and we just destroy them. But in the destruction of them, we learn a lot. And so we learn about what they're made of. We learn about the elements that they're made of, and the variations in that composition can tell us about past ocean temperature, about past ocean carbonate chemistry, or things like pH, alkalinity, and that whole system. Isotopes can tell us a lot. These are elements that have the same number of protons with different numbers of neutrons. So chemically, they behave very similarly, and they'll substitute into the shell crystal lattice. They'll be part of the building blocks of this shell, but depending on different processes, different isotopes can substitute into that shell and then be locked in and preserved through time. And so by analyzing the isotopic composition of the shell, we can also learn things about the size of the great ice sheets over the last ice ages. We can learn about all kinds of things that I find kind of mind-blowing. So we specialize in collecting marine sediments, figuring out how old they are, extracting information from them, and then putting it into a regional and global context to help us understand how the ocean and the Earth's climate system are behaving through time.
Do you focus that on the Gulf of Maine, that sediment research in one specific area of the ocean, or not?
I study multiple areas of the ocean. 2 recent projects have been focused in the Gulf of Maine, which has been really exciting for me because I grew up here, and so I have that personal connection, but also the Gulf of Maine is really fascinating. It's a very interesting part of the global ocean. It's very sensitive in a way to changes that occur. And so it's a great place to study different questions about how does ocean circulation change through time and why? And how does, for example, a change in the input of meltwater from the Arctic change what's going on in the greater North Atlantic and in the Gulf of Maine specifically? And by looking at the history of the past behavior can give us some clues into what's happening now and what might happen in the future. There's no past mode of the Earth that we could study that's a dead ringer for what our future is going to look like, but it at least helps us study the dynamics. How fast can things change? What is the scale of the change? Are there tipping points in the system? So in the Gulf of Maine, I was really excited to come back to the University of Maine. And when I first got here, even before I got here, I was dreaming about, okay, what can we do? How can we tap into these records that haven't been fully explored yet? I have 2 projects, one that's been funded for a few years now, and we've been working on it, and one that is just going to start in September from the National Science Foundation. And those 2 projects are linked. And really, the first one is focusing on the Holocene, so the last 11,000 years of history in the Gulf of Maine. And we're trying to figure out how ocean temperatures changed throughout that period and how that relates to other processes going on in the broader region. And then the other project is from 11,000 years, diving even deeper back into time, back to the last ice age, basically, to figure out how the last ice age ended and how the millennial scale changes, these sort of shifts that happen, the jolts out of it wasn't a smooth transition out of the last ice age. It was kind of bumpy. And it's very interesting that it was bumpy. And we're trying to understand, what is it that shifts us from a glacial mode of the Earth into an interglacial mode? And then what are the dynamics, the things that control ocean climate system on those timescales? How does it behave? Last summer, I, for the very first time, served as a chief scientist on a research cruise all by myself. As a chief scientist with a huge, wonderful team of students and postdocs and staff on the research vessel Endeavor out of the University of Rhode Island. And we went out in the Gulf of Maine and we collected sediment cores. And those sediment cores form the basis of a lot of this work.
One of the reasons I asked why you were focusing on the Gulf or other places, you work in a couple of different oceans. Are you able to sample the same time frame and then almost create a map of those time frames and have it show you a larger picture of the more global environment? Part of the problem, it seems to me, is that things are changing, right? Like the basin can only go back 150 million years, but the ocean is pretty turbulent. I would imagine the sediment is pretty turbulent. How do you map together the work you're doing with the work other people are doing so that you do have a broader scale or a broader understanding of what's happening?
That's a great question. The sedimentary records that are preserved on the seafloor, they vary in their nature because, as you said, that it's a heterogeneous environment, and they vary in their time span. So the Gulf of Maine, actually, the records in the Gulf of Maine specifically don't go back nearly as far as deeper, farther offshore basins. They only go back to the last ice age, because during the last ice age, it was full of ice. It was full of an ice sheet. It sort of carved it out. And so the sediments that have accumulated since have been accumulating over the last 20 odd thousand years. I am able to compare records from the Gulf of Maine with records from elsewhere. And that is part of the approach, is to understand, how source waters in the Arctic are changing and how that affects us downstream in a way. So there are records from Labrador Sea that partly inspired this work that I'm doing now. I said, oh, wow, well, another group found evidence using foraminifera, these single cell organisms. They found evidence that the last gasp of the ice sheet, the last little drips of meltwater coming out into the ocean ended about 8,000 years ago. And I thought, I wonder how that transition looked in the Gulf of Maine. And we're sort of interested in looking into that. So absolutely, comparing sites is essential to piecing together the big picture. And actually, in the earliest days of paleoceanography, one of the things that happened was even generating a paleoceanographic record at one site is a stupendous amount of effort. It's so much work. And so as paleoceanographers, we have to work together. We have to work well with others. It's just a job requirement to be really successful and to really gain new insights. And so a single person or even a single group can make huge strides, but really to gain a global picture, scientists have to band together nationally, internationally, and pull together information from the whole entire globe. If you're trying to understand global change, you need to have a global scope. It's just a lot of work. And so in the earliest days, going back decades, there was a project called CliMap, where scientists joined forces and pieced together these records that attempted to cover the global ocean to estimate what the surface of the ocean looked like in terms of its mean temperature during the last ice age, and compared it to what it looks like today. That just one slice of time, but the whole surface ocean, that was a monumental effort. And it's actually cool to be here because there's a lot of history. CliMac, many of the members at the University of Maine who are still around, many of the members of the Climate Change Institute and the School of Earth and Climate Sciences were involved in that back in the day. And so it requires a lot of collaboration to build a global picture. It's not easily done by single operators. In a way, it's really exciting to compare records from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific and try to piece together how the hemispheres behaved across these glacial interglacial cycles, where there's different solar forcings predicted for these different regions, to actually go to these different sites and generate records and test hypotheses regarding these different energy inputs from the sun and different climate theories. It's really exciting. There's so much to do. There's no way I'm going to be bored moving forward. We need everybody. We need all the students. Everybody needs to join forces on this because it's a big, big job.
So I don't want you to think I forgot about you mentioning that you finally got to be a chief science officer. It's a pretty great title to have. Maybe this would be a good time for you to explain exactly what that means. And I assume it involves a significant amount of the collaboration that you just talked about.
Yeah, being a chief scientist on a research cruise involves conceiving of a project, having a big idea, and then finding funding for it, and then actually executing your plan. It involves a lot of learning, especially for somebody who's never done it before. It involves a lot of coordination and As a first-time chief scientist, I had to learn a lot about coring equipment and A-frame strengths and cables and wires. And oh my God, it takes a village, a huge village. And I was grateful that these people who run these research vessels, typically out of different research universities, and the people who also are part of the marine sediment sampling group, whose job is to help people collect marine sediment, were so supportive and so helpful. It involves a lot of planning. It involves gathering a lot of gear together to go out there and collect all your samples and store all your samples and label all your samples to prepare yourself for making decisions on the spot about, do I core here? Do I not core here? Is this going to yield the record that I'm hoping? And you pull together all of the threads of geologic backgrounds, of work that's been done before, people who've been out and done, say, seismic surveys of the area. I've studied those, and people had done some coring before. And so I studied those cores and thought about what I knew about sediment accumulation in these different areas and ideas about the history of it, and to prepare myself for making those on-the-spot decisions about, should we send the core barrel down or not? Or should we go keep looking? It involves a lot of shopping also. We build up several vehicles worth of stuff to bring with us to support all this work, and training of people and students who've never been to sea before, and trying to prepare them mentally and physically for what that would look like. During COVID, no less. That was not insignificant. But it was one of the most intense experiences in my scientific career, but it was also a lot of fun. It was an amazing feeling to be on a ship and be able to say, I'm curious about this place, let's go here. And to have this whole team of people excited to help me get there and pull up something from the seafloor that no human eyes had seen before. It was exhausting, but it was really amazing. And I am excited to do it again someday.
How long was the research cruise? How many weeks?
The research cruise itself in the Gulf of Maine was only 2 weeks, but the preparation was multiple years. And then the post-cruise analysis of material will also be multiple years. So it's different from some other ocean science areas in that when we get this sediment cores back, there's just a lot of steps involved in extracting all that information, as opposed to going out and, say, sending CTDs down, conductivity, temperature, depth sensors down, and doing that repeatedly through time to look at short-term changes. The people on the ship were like, oh, when are you coming back out again? I was like, oh, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years. So like, I've got a lot of work to do before then. It involves radiocarbon dating the material to figure out how old things are. And it's a process.
So when you get these cores, do you get to use the whole core? Or do you team up with other research groups who are using other parts of the core? And maybe it's different for each cruise.
It can vary depending on the setup of it, but these cores, particularly if they're nationally funded, for example, by NSF, then the researcher who initially conceived the study and collected the cores has sole access to that material for, I think it's 2 years. And then after 2 years, people can start to submit requests to say, hey, I'd really be interested in working on this core too. Can I have some? And I think it's brilliant because it's a huge investment of time and money and infrastructure to go out and get this material. The daily cost of running that ship was just staggering. It's a major investment. And so the goal of the system is to squeeze every last drop of science and knowledge out of those cores as humanly possible. So there are designated repositories where they're temperature controlled and they have systems of organization. They are literally libraries of mud. They have these searchable catalogs and they have specialists who know exactly how to take care of this archive. And then they also facilitate the sampling of material for years to decades. People are still working on cores that were collected several decades ago, and when at the beginning of ocean coring. So yes, lots of people end up using these cores. And sometimes it's planned right from the beginning. Like there'll be a bunch of chief scientists who get together and say, let's do this. You do this piece and I'll do this piece and I'll do this kind of analysis. And that's very typical. This Gulf of Maine project in particular was a little bit unusual in that It was an NSF career proposal, so I was the only principal investigator. But I certainly have lots of colleagues that I'm collaborating with and saying, oh, you could do this and you could do that, and sort of divvying up the materials so that we can get the most well-rounded view of the past that we can.
I preface this by saying I have no idea if this is even possible for you to answer since you have so much more research or analysis to do. What is your data telling you about cyclic patterns and climate and 100 million years ago versus 50 million years ago versus now? Is there anything that you can pinpoint that would enlighten us and or surprise us?
The Gulf of Maine work is still coming along. We're still figuring out age models, or in other words, we're trying to figure out exactly what time spans our cores are covering. But in work that I'd done previously, and that it is still ongoing in the South Pacific Ocean and elsewhere, has shown us fairly definitively that during the last ice age, the ocean stored more carbon than it does today. So you've probably seen those glacial, interglacial cycles of CO2 and temperature. Al Gore made them famous in his documentary, but they sort of go up and down across glacial cycles, and now they're sort of skyrocketing. Well, one of the questions that scientists have been probing is how and why is the carbon cycle changing across ice age cycles? Where did that CO2 go out of the atmosphere? It's not a big surprise that a lot of it went into the ocean because it's one of the largest and vastest responding reservoirs on the Earth's surface in terms of carbon. But it's been helpful for us to delve deeper into that and to find out, okay, well, how much carbon was stored in the deep ocean and where was it? When was it released? And how does the ocean breathe in and out across ice ages? That can tell us a little bit about the ocean's capacity for carbon storage and how that changes through time. So one of the exciting things that I found was that in the South Pacific Ocean, there was a lot more dissolved carbon stored at mid-depths than there is today. And that very rapidly at the end of the last ice age, right about when the southern hemisphere westerly winds were shifting south, a lot of that carbon appeared to be transferred back to the atmosphere. So it supports a lot of research today, a lot of dynamics that are focused more on the last few decades, that it's really the interaction of the strength and the position of the southern hemisphere westerly winds that can sort of open and close the door to the deep ocean in terms of CO2 exchange. And it's not just happening today, but it has been happening for a long time. So it's a small piece of the puzzle, but it's exciting to be able to contribute something to that.
Are you able to tell what happens with the ocean when that carbon goes back into the atmosphere with the westerly winds?
We see this chemical signature change, yes, after the carbon exits the ocean. Yeah, it's different.
But can you identify how that impacts the other creatures in the ocean at that time?
In terms of ecology, that's not really my strength. I have a very one-track.
You could tell me, you could just say, Kate, that is not my question to answer, and that would be fine.
It's a really interesting question, though. If you think about it, there are huge changes on glacial to interglacial scales. I mean, think about on the terrestrial side of things, where mammoths were roaming and saber-toothed creatures were roaming the surface of the Earth. Big changes were happening in the ocean as well, with big temperature and salinity and carbon storage changes as well. Absolutely. The whole distribution of organisms does certainly shift. And that is another big change that the environment experiences across ice age cycles. But I think temperature is a really big one. Temperature and food, organisms seem to care about a lot, and oxygen. And when those things change, then the populations tend to shift or disappear and reappear, or, shift latitude or shift depth in the ocean. We see that a lot too. And particularly in the cores that we've been working on, one of my grad students is working on cores in the South Pacific Ocean and in the Indian Ocean. And she is seeing not just chemical changes through time, but the certain species just appear and disappear. Like they're super happy during certain periods of time when the conditions are just great for them. And then they just disappear, like not present. And that is also really crucial information. We don't fully understand it yet, but we absolutely see that there's a lot going on in these environments.
So you mentioned you had a postdoc with education. You've mentioned your graduate students, and you mentioned the REU that you did as an undergrad. How cool and interesting does it make your life to have undergraduates, graduate students, and probably postdocs working with you with all different levels of understanding of paleoceanography.
Very interesting. They keep me honest too, because it's often the students who have the least background in the field that ask the most profound questions. Even my 4-year-old daughter asks me questions that just stump me all the time. So it's one of the favorite things about my job is that I get to work with students and collaborators who all bring their own perspectives and their own curiosity to the table. And it inspires me. It's one of the things that really keeps me going is to be a part of their journey and exploring our planet, and to be somehow helping them along the way is just very rewarding to me. It just amazingly enriches my own experience as well, because there's so many facets of what we're studying, and it's just impossible for one brain to sort of see it from every angle. And so working with a diverse team of people it's a lot of fun. It's really wonderful. And it's one of the things that I love about being here and having the opportunity to have a research group.
So the other small bit of education I'll have you talk about, this is a stretch, so you'll enjoy this, is the work that you did with a public science event that we had with the warming sea, where that audience was a really interesting mix. For people who don't know about the warming sea, it was a commissioned piece about climate change in the Gulf of Maine. And we had this whole headliner talking about climate change in the Gulf of Maine in particular. And we had a real mix of science enthusiasts and we had symphony enthusiasts. I lost track of how many people said to me afterwards, I had no idea what to expect. They would tell me what an extraordinary experience it was for them. And they thought they were just going to hear a musical piece. They had no idea there was going to be all this science context. And I'm sure that when we roped you into this via Seth Campbell, my guess is I did not prep you enough for the music part and the art part of it. But you did a great job laying the foundation. And that's really hard to do. It's really hard to meet people where they are, number one, but also who are there for what they think is an art event. And how do you rope them in? Have you had any experience doing that otherwise? Or did that feel like a new thing that you drew on your other education work for?
Well, it was a wonderful experience for me. I think that the instructions were totally adequate.
Okay. I wasn't fishing.
I was able to learn a lot from the Science Festival page about the evolution of that musical journey that was involved. It was an incredible piece of work, and it really resonated with me on a lot of levels. I grew up playing music. I used to play the trumpet back in the day. I was a band camp nerd. The music has been and remains, really important to me. And so it was just beautiful to see how our understanding of what we call the science, so the Western science tradition, was supposed to be sort of an impartial, devoid of emotions, logical understanding of the world, being intentionally infused with this emotional, artistic, almost spiritual feeling, understanding of what are we living through and what does the future hold. I found that the marriage of those things was extremely powerful. And I don't think I've ever been part of anything that was quite like that. So in a way, it was totally new to me. But I feel like on a daily basis, I'm trying to bridge that gap as a living, breathing, feeling human doing science. I'm not a robot, and scientists aren't robots. And we shouldn't just pretend that we are. The best that we can do is to understand what our backgrounds and our biases and our preconceived notions are and sort of keep them in mind as we interpret things. That's really the best that we can do. And I just found it very refreshing to be a part of putting those things together and saying, these are all connected. We can't divorce our emotions from our understanding. They're all part of it. And I, as a climate scientist, have struggled for a long time to deal with the anxiety and the depression and the sense of helplessness occasionally that will start to creep in when you're having a bad day or something seems particularly dire. It's important to stay in touch with the emotions that people feel, because that translates into action or inaction as well. If we really care about this, we need to acknowledge that there are multiple layers to the messaging and to what we're learning. And I think even as climate scientists ourselves need to be honest about how it makes us feel and what we can do and how we can frame things so that we don't give up. there is absolutely hope and we can move forward and there are things to do. And yes, there are signs that the earth is changing and that is certainly happening, but it doesn't mean that we have to throw up our hands. And I just found that the Warming Sea event, the piece itself was just so beautiful and so powerful. And the audience response was unbelievable afterwards. I was just so touched by the things that people said to me afterwards. And I'd never experienced anything quite like it.
That's really great. I'm thrilled that you got so much out of it. It was a true experiment in every sense of the word from day one, when we figured out that this is what we were going to do, and we didn't know. And I do think it was a really hard ask for our scientists across the board, because we have rarely given scientists in the Western tradition permission to recognize that what they're working on can be really hard emotionally. We're not very good at that, at acknowledging that. Anyway, I really appreciated that. I appreciated the fact that you were willing to do it, because it was such a strange request. It was just so outside the box, so outside the norm. Personally, I think we need more of that.
Count me in.
Oh, Kat, I agree. You're going to regret saying yes to that. So this has been a really wonderful conversation. I am so appreciative of your time, but more importantly, I'm appreciative of your work. This is one of the few times my colleague is right, that if people could see your face, your whole face lights up when you talk about your work in every way, shape, or form. It's really inspiring. So one of these days, we're going to have to figure out how to put all these videos out there so people can see what I see about how genuinely excited you are. I think it actually comes through no matter what. I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing and the students that you're teaching.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your work and your persistence over all these bumpy years of bringing all this science to the public and asking all of these wonderful questions. And I'm just really floored by what you've achieved. And I'm so, so delighted to be a small part of this.
Thank you. And you'll be a bigger part now that you said you're in.
Okay, it's a deal.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is hosted by me, Kate Dickerson. This episode was edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. We received financial support from Central Maine Power, production support from Miranda Bouchard, and social media support from Next Media. The Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.